At the heart of Briarcliff University, nestled in the quiet outskirts of New York, Lena Gosling was a figure that commanded both admiration and suspicion. At 34, she had it all: a prestigious position as an English professor, a reputation for her brilliance in Renaissance literature, and an air of mystery that seemed to captivate her students. Lena was beautiful, intelligent, and poised, but there was something darker beneath the surface, a past she tried desperately to bury beneath a veneer of academic success and control. Her life had not always been this way. Born into a wealthy family in Boston, Lena's childhood was marked by an oppressive sense of loneliness. Her father, a stern investment banker, and her mother, a socialite with a penchant for extravagant cocktail parties, offered Lena every material possession a child could want. But love? That was something she had to learn to live without. The emotional neglect she suffered at home was a wound that never healed, and as she grew older, Lena buried her pain in the comfort of her books, using her intellect as both shield and weapon. After completing her PhD at Yale, Lena's future seemed limitless. But a scandal, an affair with her married thesis advisor, shattered that dream. The whispers of the academic community were louder than the cheers of her accomplishments, and soon, Lena found herself blacklisted from the prestigious institutions she had once dreamed of joining. In the wake of the scandal, Lena fled to Briarcliff, a small town far from the watchful eyes of the Ivy League, seeking solace and a fresh start. Here, at Briarcliff University, Lena reinvented herself. She became a rising star, revered by her students for her captivating lectures and innovative teaching methods. Her lectures on modern poetry and Renaissance literature drew students from across departments, and colleagues admired her dedication to her craft. To everyone around her, Lena seemed like the perfect professor, the epitome of success, intelligence, and grace. But beneath her polished exterior, Lena was haunted by the ghosts of her past. She was driven by an insatiable need for validation, constantly craving the admiration and affection of those around her. Her relationships, both personal and professional, were intense but fleeting. No matter how many accolades she received, Lena always felt empty, misunderstood, and alone. It was this hunger for recognition that led her to Ryan Holloway. Ryan had been a student at Briarcliff for only a few weeks, but from the moment he stepped into Lena's class, he was entranced. At 19, Ryan was everything Lena had hoped to mold, a bright, talented young man whose intellectual passion seemed like a reflection of her own in younger years. But there was something about Ryan that made him vulnerable, something she recognized all too well. Ryan wasn't just a student, he was a blank canvas, eager for guidance but also in desperate need of emotional connection. As he sat in the back row, nervously fiddling with his pen, Lena's eyes paused on him for just a moment. The connection was instant. The seed of manipulation was planted. Ryan didn't know it yet, but his life was about to be changed forever. The subtle, almost imperceptible way Lena drew him in, with her magnetic charm and sharp intellect, was only the beginning. What started as innocent mentorship was about to spiral into something much darker, something Ryan would never have imagined. Lena Gosling's upbringing was a tapestry of luxury and isolation, woven together by the cold, unyielding hands of her parents. Born into one of Boston's wealthiest families, she had every material possession a child could dream of. The finest clothes, the most prestigious tutors, and a sprawling mansion on Beacon Hill that radiated old money and status. But for all the glittering opulence of her surroundings, there was something conspicuously absent: love. From an early age, Lena learned that the world around her was not designed to nurture her emotional needs. Her father, a ruthless investment banker, was a man of logic and discipline, where feelings were considered a luxury to be discarded. Her mother, a socialite of immense beauty and charm, spent more time at cocktail parties and charity galas than in the comfort of her own home. She was always busy, always outwardly perfect, but emotionally distant. As a child, Lena sought solace in the only place where she could escape the emotional neglect: her books. The worlds contained in those pages were far more inviting than her reality. She buried herself in literature, finding comfort in the written word, crafting an armor of intellect and achievement to shield herself from the harshness of her home life. It was in those pages that Lena first began to excel, finding a sense of purpose in academic competition. While Lena's peers were out playing in the gardens or attending family dinners, she retreated into her studies, determined to make her parents proud. But no matter how many awards she won or grades she earned, she never felt seen. There was no warm hug from her father, no comforting words from her mother. The only affection she received came from the praise of teachers and the academic world. It was enough to keep her going, but it wasn't love. Lena's intellect became her shield and her weapon. She outpaced her classmates in every subject, eventually skipping 2 grades and entering Harvard at the age of 16. Her prodigious talent for analysis and writing was recognized immediately, but so was her insufferable loneliness. At Harvard, she was celebrated for her brilliance but dismissed for her social ineptitude. She was too reserved, too distant, too fixated on her academic goals to fit in with the other students. Still, the accolades kept coming. She was soon accepted into the prestigious PhD program at Yale, where her academic career truly began to soar. The world of academia, she believed, was where she could finally find the validation she longed for. It was there that she would find her worth. But even in the hallowed halls of Yale, Lena's emotional needs were left unaddressed. She found solace in one particular figure, her thesis advisor, an older, married man who shared her passion for literature and history. At first, the relationship was purely academic, professional even. But as the late-night study sessions turned into long dinners and quiet walks in the courtyard, Lena's walls began to crumble. For the first time in her life, she felt seen, not for her grades or her intellect, but for her raw, unguarded self. The affair began innocently enough, or so Lena told herself. She had convinced herself it was a connection born out of mutual respect, 2 people drawn together by their love of literature. But beneath the surface, the affair was far more complicated. Lena had never experienced real intimacy, never allowed herself to feel truly vulnerable, and the power dynamic between her and her married advisor was intoxicating. The emotional dependence that developed between them was, for Lena, a form of validation. She believed she was finally loved, finally wanted, for something other than her intellect. But that feeling, as it so often did in her life, was fleeting. The affair was discovered by the university, and Lena was publicly humiliated. Her advisor's career was saved, but Lena's was ruined. The whispers in the halls of Yale became a cacophony of judgment, and the academic community, once her haven, now turned its back on her. She was dismissed from Yale with a tarnished reputation, branded as the young, naive woman who had crossed a line, broken the sacred professional boundary between student and mentor. This scandal crushed Lena. It shattered the fragile sense of self she had built, leaving her adrift in the world. She had no job, no home, and no place in the academic world that had once revered her. But there was one option left for her: escape. She retreated from New Haven, leaving behind the friends and colleagues who had once supported her. She moved to Briarcliff, a quiet town on the outskirts of New York, far from the prying eyes of the academic world. In Briarcliff, Lena reinvented herself once again. She took a position at Briarcliff University, a small but respectable institution with a strong humanities department. Lena's talents were quickly recognized, and before long, she was lecturing on Renaissance literature and modern poetry. The students adored her for her brilliance, her ability to captivate an audience, and her unique teaching style. To the outside world, Lena was the picture of success. She was once again the center of attention, the intellectual star of a small town. But beneath the polished surface, the emotional scars of her past remained. Lena's relationships were intense but short-lived. She still craved admiration, still sought the validation that had eluded her throughout her life. She had learned to mold herself into the image of the perfect professor, confident, knowledgeable, beautiful. But the loneliness remained, gnawing at her from the inside. Her need for emotional validation was insatiable, and no amount of academic success could fill the void. It was this need, this craving for emotional fulfillment, that ultimately led her to Ryan Holloway. In him, Lena didn't just see a student to mentor, she saw an opportunity to reclaim her lost youth and the emotional validation that had long been absent from her life. The connection between them was inevitable. Ryan, with his vulnerabilities and dreams, would become the perfect pawn in Lena's game. She would mold him, shape him, and make him her own, just as she had done with every other aspect of her life. But this time, the consequences would be far more deadly. Ryan Holloway had never known what it was like to live a life of comfort. Growing up in a modest neighborhood on the outskirts of New York, he had always felt like an outsider in his own family. The youngest of 4 children, Ryan spent much of his childhood trying to find his place in a world that seemed to favor practicality over dreams. His father, a hard-working construction worker, was a man of few words, always focused on the job at hand. His mother, a woman who juggled multiple part-time jobs to keep the household afloat, was loving but overburdened by the constant pressure to provide. They were a family built on resilience, but not on emotional expression. Ryan had always been different from his siblings. His older brothers and sisters excelled in areas that required practical skills, sports, mechanics, and business, while Ryan had always been more of a dreamer. While they spent their weekends playing football or working part-time jobs, Ryan found solace in books. He would often be found hunched over tattered paperbacks, scribbling his own stories in well-worn notebooks. He was a self-made writer, crafting entire worlds from his imagination. It was in these quiet moments, lost in the pages of his favorite authors, that Ryan felt most himself. But it was also where his isolation began to take root. At school, Ryan was known for his academic brilliance, especially in subjects like English and history. He had a way with words, his essays filled with depth and creativity. However, his grades in more structured subjects, like math and science, were mediocre at best. His peers often teased him for being the quiet kid, and while Ryan rarely showed it, the teasing stung. Despite his undeniable intelligence, Ryan's lack of confidence often overshadowed his potential. He knew he was capable of greatness, but he couldn't seem to shake the feeling that he wasn't quite enough. As Ryan entered high school, his sense of self-worth began to fray. He watched as his siblings found their paths in life. His oldest brother joined the military, his sister went off to college on an athletic scholarship, and his other brother began a successful apprenticeship as a mechanic. Ryan, on the other hand, struggled to figure out where he fit in. He was the odd one out, the dreamer in a family of doers. This sense of isolation followed him, and his grades, while still impressive in the humanities, were never enough to land him a scholarship or secure a spot at a prestigious college. The rejection letters from his dream schools hit hard. Each one felt like a confirmation of his worst fears, that he wasn't good enough, that his dreams of becoming a writer were nothing more than a pipe dream. The weight of disappointment bore heavily on Ryan, but it also fueled his desire to prove himself. He refused to accept that his family's struggles, or his own personal insecurities, would define his future. He knew that if he wanted to escape the shadow of his family's expectations, he had to carve his own path. And that path led him to Briarcliff University. When Ryan first stepped onto the campus of Briarcliff, it was nothing like he had imagined. The sprawling campus, surrounded by green lawns and stately old buildings, felt both intimidating and exhilarating. For the first time in his life, he was surrounded by people who were just as intellectually driven as he was. Yet, despite the sense of belonging, Ryan still felt like an outsider. He found himself overshadowed by the more confident and socially adept students who seemed to glide through college life effortlessly. It was here, in the shadow of the university's towering academic expectations, that Ryan met Lena Gosling. In the beginning, Lena seemed like a beacon of hope. As a young, brilliant professor, she embodied everything Ryan aspired to become. She was everything he wanted, intelligent, articulate, and poised, with a reputation that inspired awe. But beneath her polished exterior, Ryan sensed something more, an intensity, a depth to her presence that he couldn't quite place. He saw her as a mentor, someone who could guide him through the labyrinth of academia and into the world of literature he dreamed of conquering. Lena, for her part, recognized Ryan's vulnerability immediately. His raw, unpolished talent was something she could shape, something she could mold into the image of her own intellectual desires. Ryan was drawn to her in ways he couldn't explain. Her lectures ignited something in him, an energy, a passion, and a hunger for knowledge that he had never felt before. In her presence, he felt understood. He felt important. For the first time in his life, someone was paying attention to his ideas, valuing his words. His work in her class soared, and his confidence began to bloom. Lena's praise became his oxygen, and he found himself seeking her out during office hours, hanging on to every word of advice she gave him. But as his connection to Lena deepened, so too did his dependence on her. He started to look to her not just for academic guidance, but for validation, for emotional support, something he had never received from his family. Lena's influence over him became subtle at first, disguised as mentorship. She would lean in close when they discussed his writing, her perfume filling the air, her gaze lingering just a moment too long. Each word of encouragement, each touch on his arm, sent a shiver of warmth through Ryan. He felt seen, understood, and for the first time in his life, he felt important. But with each passing day, the line between mentorship and manipulation blurred. As Ryan's reliance on Lena grew, so did his sense of confusion and guilt. His emotional state began to shift. The admiration he once felt for her was now laced with a sense of fear of disappointing her, of losing her approval. It wasn't long before Ryan found himself at the mercy of Lena's manipulation, unable to break free from the web she had woven around him. Ryan had always believed that his dreams of becoming a writer were the most important thing in his life. But now, as he grew more entangled in Lena's web, he realized that his desire to succeed had become intertwined with his desperate need for her approval. And that, Ryan soon realized, was the most dangerous trap of all. For Lena, Ryan was not just a student to mold, he was the last piece of a puzzle she had been assembling for years. She would never let him go, not without a fight. The line between mentor and something far more complicated began to blur the moment Lena set her sights on Ryan. What began as a simple academic relationship quickly escalated into something far darker, a psychological dance that neither of them fully understood at the time. In those early days, Lena maintained the guise of a caring professor, offering Ryan extra help with his assignments and inviting him to exclusive literary events. She saw in him not just a student, but a fragile, impressionable young man whose intellectual passion mirrored her own. For Ryan, she became a mentor, a guiding star in his pursuit of literary greatness. But for Lena, Ryan was more than just a promising student, he was a canvas on which she could project all her desires for control and validation. It started innocently enough. Ryan would attend her office hours, sitting across from her as she carefully reviewed his essays. Lena's comments were always a delicate mix of praise and subtle criticism, designed to keep him coming back for more. She would lean in close, her voice soft, her perfume lingering in the air, as she pointed out the small details that needed improvement. Ryan, hungry for approval, hung on every word she said. Her praise filled the empty spaces inside him, the spaces his family had never bothered to fill. Lena knew this. She saw how much he needed her, how desperate he was to be seen, to be validated. And she played on it expertly. She shared personal anecdotes with him, stories of her own struggles as a young academic, the isolation she had felt, the prejudice she had endured. Each story was a carefully crafted performance designed to draw Ryan in, to make him feel that they were kindred spirits, bound by a shared experience of intellectual isolation. It was the beginning of the illusion. Ryan began to believe that Lena wasn't just his professor, she was his ally, his confidant, someone who truly understood him. As the weeks passed, Lena began to subtly shift their interactions. What started as academic discussions began to evolve into deeply personal conversations. She would ask him about his childhood, his family, his fears. Lena's questions were always probing, always designed to get Ryan to open up, to expose his vulnerabilities. And Ryan, eager for someone to understand him, willingly obliged. Each confession he made to Lena felt like a moment of connection, a moment of intimacy that he had longed for his whole life. But for Lena, it was never about connection. It was about control. She began to influence Ryan's choices in ways he didn't even realize. When he mentioned his dreams of becoming a writer, Lena would offer suggestions on which books to read, which authors to study. She steered his intellectual development in ways that suited her, subtly pushing him away from the ideas and writers she didn't approve of and toward those she favored. As Ryan became more dependent on her for academic validation, he also began to rely on her emotionally. His relationships with his peers started to falter as he grew more and more isolated, his world shrinking to the small office where Lena held court. One afternoon, Lena invited Ryan to a private dinner at her apartment. It was presented as a casual meeting to discuss his final paper for her class, but both of them knew it was more than that. Lena's apartment was sleek and modern, filled with bookshelves lined with volumes of literature. She poured them both glasses of wine, and they sat at her dining table, discussing their shared love of literature. But as the night wore on, the atmosphere shifted. Lena's questions became more personal, her tone more intimate. She spoke of her past in an even more vulnerable way, portraying herself as a misunderstood genius, persecuted by her colleagues for her brilliance. Ryan, already enthralled by her intellect, felt a sense of awe. Here was a woman who truly understood the artist's struggle, the loneliness that came with pursuing something so difficult, so isolating. Then, Lena did something subtle but telling. She reached out, brushing her hand against his as they spoke. Ryan's heart skipped a beat, the electric charge of the contact sending a rush of warmth through him. It was a simple gesture, but to Ryan, it felt like a sign, a signal that their bond was deeper than he had ever imagined. It was in that moment that the first cracks in his emotional armor began to show. Lena had turned their intellectual relationship into something more, something dangerous, something that Ryan wasn't sure how to navigate. But Lena wasn't finished. Over the following weeks, her manipulations became even more brazen. She began to shower Ryan with gifts, rare books, vintage notebooks, expensive pens. She framed each gift as an investment in his future as a writer, subtly binding him to her with each thoughtful gesture. Ryan, overwhelmed by the attention and approval, could not see the trap being set around him. His grades, which had been mediocre in other subjects, began to improve dramatically, and Lena, with her influence, made sure to intervene on his behalf with other professors. She painted him as a misunderstood genius, a student who simply needed the right guidance to succeed. For Ryan, these acts of kindness felt like salvation. He began to believe that without Lena, he would never succeed, never make it in the competitive world of academia. His anxiety over his future grew, and he found himself more and more dependent on her for both his academic achievements and his sense of self-worth. His writing, once filled with a raw, unique voice, started to mimic Lena's style. The change was subtle at first, but it became impossible to ignore. Ryan no longer wrote for himself. He wrote for Lena, seeking her approval in every word. As their relationship grew more intense, Ryan's world became increasingly insular. His friends noticed the change, the way he withdrew from social activities and spent all his time either in Lena's office or at home, writing. But Ryan didn't care. He believed Lena was the key to his success, the only one who truly understood him. In her, he saw a mentor, a protector, and, in the deepest parts of his heart, he began to see her as something more, a lover, a savior. But what Ryan didn't realize was that Lena had no intention of being his savior. She was the one in control, and he was merely a pawn in a dangerous game she had been playing for years. The more Ryan relied on Lena, the more she tightened her grip on him. What started as an innocent mentorship had evolved into something much darker, something that would lead to a point of no return. Neither of them could have predicted where it would go, but Lena was already planning the next move in her intricate dance of manipulation. Ryan had unknowingly become her obsession, and the consequences of that obsession would soon become tragically clear. As the months went by, the carefully crafted illusion that Lena had built around herself and Ryan began to crack. The once innocent mentorship, which had evolved into a suffocating bond, was now teetering on the edge of destruction. Ryan had become so dependent on Lena for his success and self-worth that he didn't even recognize how deeply entangled he had become in her web. But Lena's grip, as tight as it was, could only hold for so long. Ryan's feelings for Lena had shifted, but not in the way she expected. What had once been admiration and intellectual connection now carried an undercurrent of confusion, resentment, and guilt. The more time he spent with her, the more he began to question what they had really become. He knew, deep down, that their relationship wasn't normal. The constant meetings, the private dinners, the whispered conversations, the praise that bordered on obsession, none of it sat right with him anymore. He began to feel suffocated, trapped in a relationship that wasn't just professional but something far more dangerous. As the semester progressed, Ryan's anxiety grew. His grades were improving, but at a cost. His relationships with his peers had become almost non-existent. He spent all his time either in Lena's office or holed up in his dorm, poring over his writing, hoping to find some escape, some relief from the overwhelming pressure that Lena's constant attention placed on him. His thoughts were consumed by her, his actions governed by her approval. The tipping point came when Ryan realized that his writing, his passion, had begun to change. What once felt like his own voice was now indistinguishable from Lena's. He no longer wrote for himself, he wrote for her. Every essay, every story was an attempt to meet her expectations, to win her favor. The realization hit him hard: he was no longer the writer he wanted to be. He was a puppet, and Lena was the one pulling the strings. But it wasn't just the writing that changed. Lena's emotional manipulation, once subtle, had now become overt. She had begun to insinuate that Ryan's future depended entirely on her continued favor. If he failed to meet her expectations, there would be consequences. Lena had become a figure of power and control in every aspect of his life. She was no longer just the mentor, she had become a gatekeeper, and Ryan knew that his future was bound to her whims. One evening, after another tense meeting in her office, Lena made a chilling remark that would haunt Ryan for weeks. "You know, Ryan," she had said, her voice low and dripping with significance, "it would be a shame if anyone were to question how you've been earning those grades." Her words lingered in the air, the weight of the implied threat hanging over him. He could feel his stomach twist into knots. He had heard the rumors, the whispers among students about her favoritism, the hushed conversations about the closeness of their relationship. But this was something else entirely. Ryan's unease turned to dread. He could feel the walls closing in on him. Every action, every word, every decision he made seemed to lead back to Lena. Her praise was like a drug, but every hit came with a cost. He was drowning, and he couldn't breathe without her approval. Yet the more he tried to break free, the tighter she pulled him in. The anxiety reached its peak as midterms approached. Ryan knew that his future was on the line. He had to succeed, he had to prove that he was worthy of Lena's favor, that he was worthy of being her protégé. But beneath the surface, the guilt gnawed at him. The more he tried to rationalize his dependence on her, the more he realized how toxic their relationship had become. He could feel his moral compass slipping, his sense of self eroding. The breaking point came one fateful night when Ryan finally summoned the courage to confront Lena. The weight of their relationship, the manipulation, the lies, it had all become too much to bear. He could no longer pretend that this was just a normal student-teacher dynamic. As he walked to her office, his heart pounded in his chest, his thoughts racing. He had to end it. He had to break free. But as he stood in front of her office door, his mind began to swirl with doubt. What would happen to him if he walked away? Would she destroy him? Would he be left with nothing? When he entered the office, Lena was waiting for him. Her calm, calculating eyes fixed on him, as though she had been expecting this moment all along. "Ryan," she began, her voice smooth, "I've been thinking about your future. You have so much potential, but potential alone won't get you anywhere." The words hung in the air, suffocating him. Ryan opened his mouth to speak, to say the words that had been building inside him for so long, but he couldn't. He was paralyzed. He wanted to confront her, to demand answers, but all he could do was listen as Lena's voice wrapped around him like a suffocating coil. "You think you can walk away from this," Lena said, her tone cold, "but let me remind you, Ryan, nothing you've achieved has been on your own. You owe me. You'll never make it without me." The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. There was no escape. Not for him. Not anymore. In the days that followed, the tension between them reached a fever pitch. Ryan became more withdrawn, more anxious. His friends noticed the change in him, how he had stopped attending social events, how he no longer smiled the way he used to. But they didn't know the truth. They didn't know what Lena had done to him. And then, just days before the winter break, Lena did something that pushed Ryan over the edge. In a meeting that was supposed to be about his final paper, she once again made it clear that he was nothing without her. Her words were like a death sentence, a final blow to his already fragile sense of self. "I've made you, Ryan," Lena said softly, her gaze unwavering. "Without me, you're nothing. You'll always be just another boy from a small town with big dreams and no future." That was it. The final straw. Ryan's breaking point. The darkness that had been lurking in his mind finally consumed him, and with it came the decision that would seal his fate. It was late that night when Ryan found himself walking the path near the lake behind Briarcliff University. His mind was a whirlwind of emotion, the weight of his choices pressing down on him. He had to do something, anything to end the suffocating control Lena had over him. But he couldn't turn back. What happened next was a blur. As he reached the secluded bend near the water, Lena appeared from the shadows, her face twisted with a cold, calculated rage. She had been watching him, waiting for this moment. The confrontation that had been building for weeks finally reached its deadly climax. Ryan didn't even have time to react before Lena's cold hands were on him, and everything went black. The morning after Ryan's death, the campus of Briarcliff University was eerily quiet. The usual chatter between students was absent, replaced by whispers and nervous glances. It didn't take long for the administration to acknowledge that something was terribly wrong. When Ryan's body was discovered near the lake, brutally beaten and discarded like so much trash, the quiet town of Briarcliff was thrust into the spotlight. What was once a small, peaceful community now found itself at the center of a growing mystery. Detective Kate Myers was called in to lead the investigation. A seasoned investigator from New York City, she was no stranger to violence, but there was something particularly chilling about this case. Ryan Holloway's body, found with signs of defensive wounds and signs of blunt force trauma, suggested a violent struggle. But what disturbed Detective Myers the most was the lack of obvious motive. Ryan had no history of involvement in any criminal activities. He had no enemies, no reasons for such a brutal attack. This was personal. And that, Myers knew, was always the hardest kind of crime to solve. The investigation quickly turned toward Ryan's circle of contacts, and all signs pointed to one person, Lena Gosling. As a professor at the university, she was a key figure in Ryan's life. At first, Lena appeared devastated by Ryan's death. She had been one of the last people to see him alive. Yet, there was something about her grief that seemed off, too calculated, too controlled. Her eyes, once filled with quiet authority in her lectures, now seemed to hold a coldness that was difficult to ignore. To the detectives, it didn't add up. Lena had always been a respected professor at Briarcliff, but those who knew her best were starting to wonder if there had been more to her relationship with Ryan than anyone had suspected. Colleagues and students alike began to recall moments when Lena's behavior seemed more than just professional. She had been unusually attentive to Ryan, even when other students were left to fend for themselves. Her office hours were always filled with private meetings, and rumors of a special bond between them had begun to circulate. At first, it was dismissed as harmless favoritism. But in light of Ryan's death, the whispers began to grow louder. Detective Myers interviewed Sophia Taylor, Ryan's classmate, who was one of the first to notice the strange dynamic between Ryan and Lena. Sophia, who had once admired Lena from afar, recalled how Ryan seemed to be drifting further from his friends. "He used to hang out with us, joke around," she said, her voice trembling as she spoke. "But after he started meeting with Dr. Gosling more, he stopped coming around. It was like he was obsessed with her. It wasn't right." Sophia wasn't the only one to notice. Ben Lawson, Ryan's roommate, had also observed the change in him. Ben had become increasingly concerned as Ryan's behavior grew more erratic. "He told me once that he couldn't breathe without her approval," Ben recounted. "He was so fixated on making her proud, he started ignoring everyone else, even me. And then he just stopped talking about it. It was like he was too scared to say anything more." Ben's testimony sent a shiver down Detective Myers' spine. It was becoming clear that the relationship between Lena and Ryan was more than a mere mentor-student dynamic. It was toxic, controlling, and dangerously obsessive. The puzzle pieces were beginning to fall into place. With the mounting suspicion surrounding Lena, the detectives decided to take a closer look at her emails and phone records. It wasn't long before they uncovered something chilling, a series of emails between Lena and Ryan. At first glance, they seemed innocent enough, academic discussions, advice on his writing, but a closer look revealed something more. There were subtle manipulations woven into her messages, encouraging Ryan to rely more on her guidance, praising him for his dependency, and subtly undermining his confidence in others. In one particularly telling exchange, Lena wrote, "You'll never make it without me, Ryan. I see so much potential in you, but the world doesn't understand you the way I do. Let me help you, trust me. The others will never see you for what you really are." The most damning discovery, however, came from a phone call between Lena and one of her colleagues, Dr. Lily Carter, a psychology professor at the university. During the call, Lena had made an offhand remark that made Detective Myers' blood run cold. "Ryan's such a delicate flower," Lena had said, her voice laced with a strange mix of fondness and possessiveness. "He just needs someone to nurture him. He'll understand, eventually. They all do." That phrase, "they all do," was a chilling revelation. It suggested that this wasn't the first time Lena had engaged in this kind of manipulation. Detective Myers couldn't help but wonder how many other students had fallen under Lena's spell, how many lives had been quietly altered by her need for control. Ryan, it seemed, had been the most vulnerable of them all, his emotional dependence on Lena growing so strong that he was unable to break free from her grasp. As the investigation progressed, the pieces of the puzzle began to align. Lena had been Ryan's savior, his protector, and his tormentor all at once. She had played him like a marionette, pulling the strings of his emotions, his academic career, and his very sense of self. And when he finally attempted to break free from her control, Lena had reacted the only way she knew how, with violence. The final blow came when forensic investigators uncovered a critical piece of evidence. A rock found near the lake, stained with Ryan's blood, matched the DNA of both Lena and Ryan. Additionally, surveillance footage from a nearby gas station showed Lena's car parked near the lake on the night of the murder. The evidence was mounting, and it became clear, Lena Gosling had murdered Ryan Holloway. The community of Briarcliff was rocked by the revelation. How could someone so respected, so brilliant, be capable of such a heinous crime? The students, who had once admired Lena for her intellect and poise, now found themselves questioning everything they had believed about their professor. It was a horrifying reminder that even those who appear the most put together can be hiding dark, twisted secrets. As Lena was arrested and taken into custody, the full extent of her manipulation, her control, and her obsession with Ryan came to light. The case, which had seemed so simple at first, had revealed an intricate web of lies, manipulation, and emotional abuse. The truth was even darker than anyone had imagined, and the consequences were devastating. For Ryan, it was too late. For Lena, the life she had carefully constructed was now in ruins, and the truth had finally caught up with her. The investigation was far from over, but the damage had already been done. The once respected professor who had shaped the minds of so many students was now a convicted murderer, her manipulations exposed for all to see. Lena Gosling's arrest sent shockwaves through Briarcliff University. The intellectual community that had once revered her now recoiled in disbelief. How could such a brilliant, respected professor, known for her captivating lectures and innovative teaching methods, be the same person who had orchestrated the violent murder of Ryan Holloway? The facade of the brilliant academic had crumbled, revealing the dark undercurrents of manipulation and obsession that had been hidden beneath for so long. But for Lena, the collapse had only just begun. After her arrest, Lena's life, once carefully constructed and meticulously controlled, spiraled into chaos. The professors who had once admired her for her intellect and passion now found themselves questioning everything they had believed about her. The students, many of whom had looked up to Lena as a mentor and role model, were left with shattered illusions. The reputation of Briarcliff University, once considered a quiet, idyllic haven of higher learning, was tarnished beyond repair. Lena's trial began in early 2023. The prosecution presented a mountain of evidence that seemed irrefutable. The forensic analysis, the security footage, and the chilling emails and phone records all painted a damning picture of a woman who had expertly manipulated and emotionally abused a vulnerable young student. The defense, however, attempted to paint a more sympathetic picture. They argued that Lena had been a victim of her own mental illness, a complex personality disorder that, they claimed, had led her to act in ways that were out of character. But the jury saw through the defense's arguments. The evidence was clear, and the emotional abuse she had inflicted upon Ryan, masked as mentorship, could not be excused. As the trial wore on, Lena's composure began to erode. She had entered the courtroom with the same cold, controlled demeanor that had always defined her, but as the weeks passed, cracks began to show. The realization that her life was over, the life she had worked so hard to build, began to sink in. Her once poised exterior started to crack. She would glance nervously at the jury, fidgeting with her fingers when the evidence grew too damning, and even snapped at her defense attorneys during moments of frustration. It was clear that Lena was no longer the confident, controlled professor who had captivated the minds of her students. She was a woman unraveling under the weight of her own guilt. In the final days of the trial, Lena's emotional state became increasingly unstable. Her mental health, which had been carefully shielded from the world for so long, now became a point of contention in the courtroom. Some experts testified that Lena's actions had been driven by narcissistic traits and an overwhelming fear of abandonment, making her vulnerable to emotional manipulation. Others spoke of her profound need for control, which had manifested in her obsessive relationship with Ryan. But no amount of psychological analysis could explain away the brutal murder of a young man, a murder Lena had carefully planned and executed. On the final day of the trial, Lena took the stand in her own defense. Her voice, once calm and authoritative, now wavered with emotion. She spoke of her past, of the cold, loveless childhood that had shaped her, of the academic rejection that had shattered her self-esteem. She painted herself as a victim of circumstance, a woman who had never known true love or acceptance. "I did what I thought was necessary to survive," Lena told the court, her eyes welling with tears. "I gave everything to Ryan. I believed in him when no one else did. And I thought he needed me." Her words, though emotional, fell flat. The jury, unmoved by her pleas for sympathy, deliberated for only 6 hours before returning a unanimous guilty verdict. Lena was convicted of first-degree murder, the maximum sentence for her crime. The judge, her voice heavy with the gravity of the moment, sentenced Lena to life in prison without the possibility of parole. There would be no redemption for her. No chance for escape. As Lena was led away in handcuffs, the courtroom erupted in a mixture of disbelief, anger, and sorrow. The man who had once been the object of her obsession, Ryan Holloway, was gone. His family, who had been shattered by his untimely death, sat silently, their grief palpable. They had lost a son, a brother, a young man with a bright future ahead of him, all because of one woman's insatiable need for control. The tragedy didn't end with the verdict. The aftermath of Lena's arrest and conviction left an indelible mark on Briarcliff University. The once vibrant campus was left reeling, the community forced to confront the uncomfortable reality that one of their own had turned a place of learning into a place of manipulation and murder. Faculty and students alike struggled to reconcile the Lena they had known with the monster that had been revealed in the courtroom. In the wake of her conviction, the university implemented new policies to prevent such a tragedy from ever happening again: mandatory workshops on student-teacher boundaries, new protocols for reporting inappropriate behavior, and stricter monitoring of faculty interactions with students. But for the families affected by Lena's actions, Ryan's family, who had been blindsided by his death, and for Lena's own family, who now had to come to terms with the woman she had become, the scars would last a lifetime. The community, so eager to move past the scandal, was forced to confront the darkest corners of human nature, and the dangerous consequences of unchecked power and obsession. As for Lena, her life as she knew it was over. The carefully curated persona of the brilliant professor, the beloved mentor, had crumbled into dust. In prison, she would face a lifetime of solitude and introspection, far removed from the world she had once controlled with such ease. No longer would she stand before a class of eager students, admired for her intellect and authority. She was now just another prisoner, another woman whose need for control had led her to destroy everything she had built. Lena's story, once one of academic triumph, would now be remembered for its tragic, destructive end. And in the quiet corners of Briarcliff University, the memory of Ryan Holloway, a young man whose potential had been stolen from him, would haunt the halls for years to come. Lena Gosling's conviction sent ripples far beyond the walls of Briarcliff University. The once peaceful academic institution, which had prided itself on fostering intellectual growth and nurturing young minds, was left to pick up the pieces after the tragedy. The entire community was shaken to its core, as the revelation of Lena's true nature left many questioning how such a thing could happen under their watch. Professors, students, and administrators all grappled with the same unsettling question: how could they have missed the signs? In the aftermath of the trial, Briarcliff University took swift and deliberate action to prevent such a tragedy from ever happening again. Stricter policies were put in place, not only concerning teacher-student relationships but also on mental health support for both students and faculty. Workshops on ethics and boundaries were introduced as mandatory for all staff, emphasizing the importance of recognizing and addressing manipulative behaviors before they could escalate into something much darker. But despite these efforts, the damage had already been done. Lena's actions could never be undone, and for Ryan's family, the pain of his untimely death was a wound that would never heal. Ryan's family, devastated by their loss, began the slow and painful process of grieving. His mother, who had always believed in his potential, was left with an overwhelming sense of guilt. She had tried so hard to support his dreams, but now, in the silence of her home, she could only ask herself if there had been more she could have done to protect him. His father, a man of few words, found himself at a loss. The boy who had once sat at their dinner table, excited to talk about his latest writing projects, was now gone. And Ryan's friends, who had been the closest witnesses to the subtle changes in his behavior, struggled with their own feelings of helplessness. They had seen the warning signs, but they hadn't known how to intervene. But in all the sadness, there was a silver lining. The tragedy had sparked an important conversation, one that needed to happen. The conversation about the toxic dynamics that can sometimes exist between students and teachers. About the dangerous power imbalance that can arise in academic environments. And about the importance of recognizing emotional abuse, manipulation, and coercion in all forms. For many, Lena's story served as a wake-up call. It forced people to look more closely at the relationships they had with those in positions of power, whether in education, the workplace, or even at home. It was a stark reminder of how easily the boundaries between professional and personal can blur, and how dangerous it can be when they do. The tragedy of Ryan Holloway's death was not just a story of a promising young man whose life was cut short. It was a story about the destructive power of unchecked authority, the vulnerabilities that make us susceptible to manipulation, and the importance of speaking up when something doesn't feel right. It was a story that highlighted the need for more awareness, better boundaries, and stronger safeguards to protect those who are most at risk. As Lena sat in her prison cell, serving a life sentence without the possibility of parole, she was left to reflect on the destruction she had caused. There were no second chances, no way to undo the harm she had inflicted on Ryan, his family, and the entire community. She had lost everything: her career, her reputation, and, most tragically, her humanity. The price of her obsession and manipulation had been far too high, and there would be no redemption for her. But Ryan's story, the story of a young man whose potential had been stolen by a toxic and dangerous relationship, could not be forgotten. His memory, his passion for writing, and his dreams of becoming a great author would live on in the hearts of those who knew him best. His family, though forever broken by the loss, would carry on his legacy by telling his story, by making sure that no other young person would fall victim to the same kind of manipulation that took his life. As the Briarcliff community slowly began to heal, the question remained: how can we ensure that this never happens again? What changes can we make to prevent the abuse of power in academic environments? How do we protect the vulnerable and create safe spaces for those who might be at risk? And more importantly, how do we raise awareness of the subtle forms of manipulation that can take root in any relationship, even one that appears to be as innocent as a student-teacher connection? What do you think about this story? Do you believe that the signs of manipulation were clear enough for others to notice earlier? How can we prevent situations like this from happening again? Please leave your thoughts and comments below. We'd love to hear from you. If this story resonated with you, or if you have any personal experiences to share, don't hesitate to comment. Let's start a conversation and raise awareness. If you haven't already, make sure to like and subscribe for more true crime stories that uncover the dark truths behind everyday life. Your voice matters.